Hi, everybody. David Cantor here, host of UUCC Zoom In Live. Well, it's been quite a week this past week, hasn't it? Exhilarating, nerve-wracking, sobering. Watching the events unfold in the nation's capital and in Georgia. Some of it terrific, some of it, honestly, rather spooky. Well, our show this coming Monday, January 11, will touch on some of this, really touch on elections. Our guest is going to be Steve Dell, a member of our congregation, part of our board, one of the leaders of the former society. Steve works for the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, and he's going to chat with us about the operations of elections. How do they work? And particularly, how does mail-in balloting work? And some of the questions that we have, that you may have had, or maybe you've never had, but others have raised, about the efficacy of voting in general and voting by mail. Steve has a lot to say on the topic, a lot to say about his evolution and journey as a UU as well. So join me on Monday, January 11, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, UUCC Zoom In Live with our special guest, Steve Dell. Hope to see you then. Bye now.
I light our chalice, a symbol whose very creation took place in the struggle against injustice. May it always be a symbol of hope, a light, a beacon to gather those who wish to fight injustice together, a symbol of respite for those who are weary, and the warmth of a hearth for those in need. In this second week of Chalica, we lift up our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Or, stated differently, we believe that all people should be treated fairly and kindly. We used to come together around this table when we met in person to share our joys and concerns, the things that were beautiful in our lives and the things that brought us sorrow. I share these pebbles today symbolically for all of us, because I know there are joys in people's lives that need to be celebrated. There are birthdays, maybe births, anniversaries, and just plain old good days that deserve to be celebrated. I know that there are difficult times for people. People tired of this pandemic, tired of the isolation, frightened by the events in our nation's capital, and just having a hard time. I place this last pebble into our bowl with a hope that you'll remember you are not alone, that if you reach out, someone surely will be there to celebrate with or to help comfort you, whether you're celebrating a joy or contending with a sorrow today.
Law is not law if it violates the principles of eternal justice.
Sing So good morning. I try not to be too meta when it comes to these occasions I have to talk to the congregation, but in a week like this one, it's difficult not to talk about the process. See, on Tuesday of this week, I was getting ready to put together a pretty straightforward account of the second week of Chalica. I was hoping to kind of weave together a funny take on, the importance of compassion in particular. And I was going to do that by talking about how mean and, seriously abusive I can be to my own technology. Like, how I treat my stuff. I was going to talk about the fact that, when robots take over the world and all my technology tells the robots what I've been doing to them all these years, I'm going to be in for a world of hurt, because when technology doesn't work for me, like when my computer's slow or when my phone doesn't work like I want it to, I can be so impatient, and that can really extend into my relationships with people in real ways. I wanted to talk about the idea that compassion really starts at the micro level with us and really deep inside of ourselves, because in that relationship with an inanimate object of my cell phone, that impatience, that rage, it denies me of the compassion that I really should carry with me into the world. So I wanted to talk about the idea that true justice is a groundswell. It has to come up from all of us, and in our own lives, to be rooted in this idea of honoring the self that we are, to treat everything in the world with dignity. But then Wednesday happened, and the issue of justice suddenly took on a much bigger, a much less manageable frame. I know all of us, and I've spoke with some of you this week. I talked with families, I talked with individuals. I know all of us, of all ages, have been dealing with a week where we've been trying to make sense of unthinkable events in Washington that for many of us, we couldn't not watch. As if this past year had not already been full of stress and confusion, to have this kind of event so quickly in the new year. It's a reminder that no one's ever experienced this before, and so it feels so unprecedented. So with all of that, how does that message, my idea about micro-level compassion, how does it fit into the world in which such egregious and these unprecedented events could happen this week? How do I hold on to that idea of justice? So that it could be built into the fabric of us, and that it's all about the social and interpersonal dimensions of honoring one another through eyes of compassion. What can I point to that begins to answer the magnitude of injustice that's been on display this week? So thinking about it and trying to come to terms with it, I realized that the answer was actually closer at hand than I realized. Because fortunately, and perhaps importantly, before Wednesday happened, Tuesday happened. Now, the stories of what happened on Tuesday, and specifically what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, they kind of got swallowed this week. But that was a crucial and informative part of what I think of the story of this week. You probably have heard about Stacey Abrams before, because her stories go back to the election in November, and all the activism that she's been involved in, getting people registered to vote in the state of Georgia. If you haven't been keeping up with the news of her, by all means, catch up, because it's an extraordinary story. She had been a candidate for governor in 2018, and because of the nature of her election, she drew great deal of attention to the ways in which voter suppression had undermined her own candidacy and was undermining democracy in the state of Georgia. But what I learned, actually listening to Stacey Abrams in interviews and in responses this week, actually reminded me that my ideas about compassion and people and relationships actually all still hold true. Because what was funny is that everyone talked about her as if she was sort of like a new star, or that this had happened sort of overnight, that she had become sort of this celebrated individual because of her work in Georgia. And when I heard her in interviews, she just sort of laughed and said, well, I've been working on this for 10 years. And what she's been working on is bigger than politics, and it really has everything to do with what we think about of ourselves as people. Because her entire goal for 10 years has been to advocate for a system that represents everybody, that involves everybody in our political process. And if that is not the essence of a universalistic ethic, rooted in compassion and expressive of a vision of justice for the world, then there isn't one to find. So I try not to be overly fatalistic, but part of me sort of wonders and hopes that there's a measure of grace this week in the fact that the horrifying national events of Wednesday were paired in history with the extraordinary outcome of a more than decade-long process in the state of Georgia to make sure that as many people as was possible were represented in the elections this year. And for these things to happen during our second week of Chalica, for us, it strikes me that there's just a lesson before our eyes about what justice is, because this should show us that justice is never the outcome of force of will or aggressive violence. That justice that's authentic always comes into the world through connection and respect. You know, that it is by affirming precisely those things that are first principle names that we get to the essence of what's there in the second principle. And having kind of come to that conclusion and that better sense about what's been going on and what it says to us, that there's another important thing for us to remember, which is that, you know, these issues and the way in which they factor into our UU principles, they aren't just about making sense of the world that is. In other words, they're not just there to comfort us or help us make sense of, like, the events of this week. It's about imagining where we want to go. And with both negative and positive examples of that in full views of us, you know, for us this week, you know, just as our hymn says, you know, we have to remember that we'll get there. Heaven knows how, but we'll get there. And we know we will.
A lot of people want to skip ahead to the finish line of racial harmony, past all this unpleasantness to a place where all wounds are healed and the past is laid to rest.
Each week we come together as a people. Together we share stories, love, aspiration. We also share our bounty in ways that express our religious UU values. May this important ritual of sharing abundance remind us that making our world better is a task best shared.
Our wisdom from the global scripture comes from the words of the Reverend Ian Maher White. January 7th, 2021. Yesterday was a scary day. I've seen some people dismiss it as reality TV fascism, which it was, and 121 House Republicans and 6 Republican senators voted to reject Arizona's electoral votes. And 138 House Republicans and 7 Republican senators voted to reject Pennsylvania's electoral votes. They attempted to steal this election. 40 years of Republican activism have brought us to this point, and we find ourselves in a crucible of meaning. Who are we to become as Americans? And I believe that each of us has a part to play in this unfolding drama. As scary as yesterday was, the words of Theodore Parker, abridged and made famous by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., continue to guide my vision of us as a people. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice. Perhaps we can only see a little ways, and in the moment, this can feel disheartening. But for the 6th year in a row, the incoming Congress is the most diverse in our nation's history. For the first time, a Native American has been appointed to head the Department of the Interior, the first Native person to hold any cabinet position. Our Vice President is not only the first woman to hold this position, but is also only the second person of color as either president or vice president. Things are changing. When placed within this context, it is clear why the forces of white supremacy and misogyny protested. And the lack of police presence is deeply troubling because it seems to indicate some level of collusion. Still, the votes were cast, and Joe Biden is our incoming president. Today, there is a stench of sad failure hanging over the protest. But this battle is far from over. As people of faith, we are guided not only by what is ethically right, but also by what is morally right. That is, we are not only concerned with right actions, but also with guiding principles. Yesterday's actions have shown us who we are, but not who we have to be. The fascists have attempted to define us, and our response must go beyond rebuke, which still allows them to define the narrative. Proverbs warns us, where there is no vision, the people perish. This has been part of the Republican strategy, to demoralize and destroy hope so they can plunder. It is, I suppose, a statement of faith to say that, as sinful as this nation is and has been, I still believe. I still believe that love is possible. I still believe that justice is possible. I still believe that liberation is possible. The moral arc of the universe is long, and I can see only a little way. But the seeds of the children of our children live within me, and for them I trudge along its curvature, guided by love, justice, and liberation.
As I'm writing these words, right now there are elected officials in Washington, D.C. who are attempting to throw out electoral college votes from the state of Arizona on procedural grounds. As I'm writing these words, The country, probably a large part of the world too, is waiting on the results of one senatorial seat in the U.S. Senate. At this moment, there are 17,567 votes separating the two candidates. As I'm writing these words, there are a whole lot of people in Washington, D.C. who think that the 2020 presidential election has been stolen and the sitting president is encouraging them in the potential insurrection. As I'm writing these words, the U.S. Capitol is under threat, has been invaded by a mob who has pushed past the police and barriers that are there to protect our democratic process and are parading through the halls of Congress. As you can maybe tell, I started writing my sermon, per usual, on Wednesday. When I started writing, the most upsetting thing that seemed to be a possibility was the disenfranchisement of millions of American people. And then the possibilities became even more unimaginable. I decided to keep the beginning of my sermon, even though the world had just flipped upside down. Now, I'm all for the second principle of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, the one that states, we as a congregation affirm and promote the goal of justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. But I'm beginning to lose patience with what I think of as the anticipated results of this course of action. What is happening toward the democratic process right now, with the very seat of our federal government under attack, is the result of justice delayed for centuries, equity never given, and compassion lacking in our American culture since the very beginnings of our nation. It is well past the time that we speak plainly about this. When Europeans first landed on the shores of what would be called the Americas, discovering this new world, there were already people on it. It was not new. It was not undiscovered. Now, really, I can forgive some of the earliest invaders some of their ignorances. They probably didn't know about microbes and how the population of humans that were already here would have no defense against the many diseases that Europeans had because of generations of cross-cultural exposure and what they were carrying. The result was devastating, but not, I think, as an historian, intentional. The intentional spreading of disease happened later. It is in their naivete that I can forgive some of the things that some of the earliest Europeans did when they came to settle the Americas. I cannot and will not forgive all the things that were done. Nor am I ignorant of the stories of war between those people who already lived here. I am not a fan of the noble savage trope. Such tropes deny the agency and individuality of those hemmed in by them. When our cultural ancestors tried to enslave those who already lived here or create temporary indentured servants, it wasn't a very successful system. So instead, they imported Africans to create an enslaved population, people who neither knew the land well enough to escape easily, nor could they run into a new town and change their name and their history by blending into the white population. The first Africans were imported from Angola by the Portuguese to Jamestown, Virginia, on August 10, 1619, a full year and change before the separatist pilgrims came to the shores of the Wampanoag people at Plymouth Rock. 200 years later, in 1829, when Mexico abolished slavery, the Texians, T-E-X-I-A-N-S, Texians, a new word for me, Anglos who were living in Texas, and this is a vast oversimplification to be clear for time, the Texians revolted, and the end result was the annexation of a huge swath of northern Mexico into the United States, including the regions of Nuevo Mexico and Alta California, and the part of Texas where my ancestors were living at the time. This, of course, happened after a different group of Europeans, the Spanish, invaded the lands of the Aztecs and the Mayans in the 1520s. Later, in the 19th century, after helping so much of the West Coast develop with cheap immigrant labor, after helping build the railroads that connected our coasts, came the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then also the internment of the Japanese Americans in the 1940s. I'm not saying that all people of European descent are terrible people. I, myself, am not just descended from Aztecs and their Spanish conquerors, but also from German and Polish peasants. And if genetic tests are to be believed, a few Ashkenazi Jews way back in my history. What I'm saying is I am impatient for this justice, equity, and compassion to actually be practiced, not just bandied about as good ideas and ideals. What we have witnessed this week in our nation's capital was, for me, as a proud American with a lifelong love of history, it was to me horrifying. Shocking, as my husband said, but not surprising. Not surprising because, for the most part, the people who talked about, planned, and then engaged in this outrageous act of attacking our house's democracy, these people have and are beginning to realize that the fictional America that they grew up with, or thought they grew up in, is crumbling. The story is falling apart. Leave It to Beaver was never real. There has never been a time when every child in the United States could ride their bike down a winding suburban road, past well-manicured lawns, under carefree yet ever-present watches of their mothers who wore heels, pearls, and aprons to dust their tract homes. There was never a golden age of this nation where everyone was equal, where all you had to do was pull yourself up by your bootstraps and put your shoulder to the wheel to succeed. As actual reality sets in upon the people who have this false narrative, they found an island of disreality in the reality TV star Donald J. Trump. When their story and their leader was in danger of being replaced by other patriotic Americans, they engaged in insurgency. There is so much to say about this insurgency, and we are still too close, even in a 24-hour news cycle in this information age with overwhelming data, for me to address this event with any real clarity. What is clear is that they went to D.C. prepared to engage in rebellion. Some of them literally wore silkscreen, pre-printed t-shirts proclaiming Civil War 2021 on the front. The crowd, encouraged by the sitting President of the United States, approached the halls of Congress, armed with his permission, and set upon the seat of our democracy, where they were met by a police force that was woefully unprepared for them, which seems shocking to me, not surprising. Because the last time I was in D.C. for a march, there were tanks and armed militia nearby. I was last in D.C. for a march in January 2017, where I marched with members of this congregation and East Shore in the Women's March. So why weren't the Capitol Police prepared for a group of protesters who have a track record of violence, even within the District of Columbia itself? I've said it on social media, so I might as well say it here. The police did not respond because the protesters were largely white people, and mostly men. White people who do not fear a police response because, as Joy Reid, journalist, said on MSNBC, and I'm paraphrasing here a bit, Miss Reid said, it's because white people think they own the country. They think they own the police, and white people do not fear the police because of this. And the actions of the police at the Capitol building did nothing to dissuade them of this idea. Nothing. There have always been in our population those who had to cower in fear, not because of some fault in their own character, but because those with more power were invested in maintaining that power. That population has been a people with darker skin tones, people who speak with accents that expose their own journeys. We have been people who have loved our own sex, a different race, and we who have gathered to worship in masjids, temples, synagogues, and natural groves. Unitarian Universalists have existed both in and out of the mainstream culture. From the very beginnings of our current strain of Unitarian Universalism, we have largely looked like the rest of the dominant society, and yet we've always been slightly out of phase with our neighbors. We have enjoyed the ability to step in and out of the mainstream culture with ease, moving closer to them when advantageous and away from them when convenient. This, as every person of color knows, is called code switching. It is time for us to use our ability responsibly to phase in and out of identification with the mainstream. It is time for us to demand that justice, equity, and compassion become no longer the exception, no longer a dream. It is up to us to demonstrate, inspire, and then demand from our society the ideals that we hold. Because our ideals are compatible with all of the world's great religions. It doesn't matter if we bring this up with our Christian family, or our Muslim neighbors, or our Jewish friends, or the practicing Buddhist acquaintance. They're not going to object, nor will our atheist lunch buddy, if we tell them what we believe and how we are religiously called to act in the world. But we live in a culture where equity and justice have been denied to some segment of our population for 400 years and more. We are so accustomed to this as a culture that the mere idea of actually approaching inequity, even justice, for all our citizens has allowed a sitting president of the United States to call for an insurrection merely so he can stay in power. And that call was not only made, but it was answered by our fellow Americans. So often I hear, oh, that's not us. No, that is us. It may not be the us that sit in this sanctuary together, but it is us, a nation. And because a group of people who have been used to, raised to, expect to treat other groups as people as subhuman, as less than themselves, they find the very idea of equality so threatening that they are willing to be violent and to attack the very seat of government they claim so much to love. How on earth anyone could attack those buildings that house the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives while carrying an American flag is beyond me. And the sight of seeing some man carrying a flag, brandishing the very flag of the Confederate Rebellion into the sacred halls of our democracy made me quake with rage. Yes, I believe in justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. But I'm getting a little sick and tired of waiting for them to manifest themselves. We, friends, we have to do more than just embrace these concepts as good ideas. We need to employ them in our relationships with others, both those we agree with and with those we don't agree with. And we need to demand the kind of nation that comes when the radical notion of actual equality for all peoples is realized. I extinguish our chalice today, not the hope it brings, the beacon it is, but to symbolize the coming to the close of this time together. Not all our times together, just this time. May it always remind you of your higher self, your lofty goals, and your very humanity.